In 1804, the third U.S. President, Thomas Jefferson, had just acquired this massive piece of land through the Louisiana Purchase, and he needed someone to explore it. So, he put together a group of U.S. Army and civilian volunteers led by Captain Meriwether Lewis and Second Lieutenant William Clark. This group, known as the Corps of Discovery, had no idea that they were about to embark on one of the most dangerous expeditions in American history. Today, we're going to look at the deadliest moments of their journey, and trust me, there were many. From vicious animal encounters to starvation and accidental poisonings, here are the many ways they came uncomfortably close to death. Even before embarking on their mission, the Corps of Discovery had been warned by Native Americans about the fabled grizzly bears of the western U.S. But the men really weren't too concerned. These large bears sounded like great hunting targets that would provide lots of fur and food for their trip. Lewis, Clark, and most of the men in the party had hunted black bears on the East Coast and thought, how different can these be? Lewis would find the answer to that in summer of 1805, when he was off on his own scouting ahead of the group. While working his way along a riverbank, Lewis spotted a massive mother grizzly. Drawn by the allure of taking down this mythical beast, he drew his rifle and fired. A shot right through the lungs that would have quickly toppled any black bear he was accustomed to. But the grizzly hardly flinched. Instead, it began charging straight at him, and as it barreled toward him, Lewis realized his mistake. Grizzlies were much tougher, larger, and more dangerous than any animal he had ever faced. Lewis dove into the river and crossed the bank on the other side. Luckily, this move was enough to make the grizzly lose interest in a fight, and it turned away, sparing Lewis from the consequences of his beginner mistake. The Corps would have many more close encounters with these beasts, but after this event, they realized the grizzlies were probably best avoided and left alone. Now, the bears were tougher in the west, but so was the terrain. Only 9 days into their journey, the expedition stopped at Tavern Cave, located on the south bank of the Missouri River, just west of St. Louis. The cave was about 120 feet wide, 40 feet deep, and 20 feet high. Clark and the rest of the men ventured inside and wrote their names on the wall, which had already become a popular graffiti spot for French explorers. But while they were busy underground, Lewis wanted to climb up high for a better view. There's pinnacle rock formations around the cave that jut up 300 feet above the Missouri River. Lewis was solo climbing one of these pinnacles when he lost footing and began to slide towards a ledge. With only inches to spare, he dug his hunting knife into the ground like an ice pick and was able to save himself from a fatal freefall. The risk wasn't all for nothing, though. Lewis would have an incredible view of the river and plains from there, and he also found an indigo specimen which he recorded in his journal. As they navigated the new plains and challenges of this landscape, they also had to manage their health with limited medical knowledge and supplies. The Corps carried with them a medicine that believed could cure many ailments: thunderclappers, pills packed with mercury. These were commonly used to treat constipation and other digestive issues, but the men had no idea just how toxic mercury really was. After long stretches of eating poorly preserved and unfamiliar foods, many of the men fell ill, and these pills were handed out like candy. Unbeknownst to them, they were poisoning themselves. Their bodies suffered from mercury poisoning, fever, weakness, nausea, but at the time, the symptoms were attributed to other illnesses, and they continued to take more pills. Incredibly, despite taking these toxic pills, the men pressed on, unaware that the very medicine they relied on was doing more harm than good. Today, traces of mercury left by their latrines can still be found along the trail of their expedition, a lasting legacy of this near-deadly mistake. And if the dangers of the wild animals, illnesses, and accidents weren't enough, Mother Nature herself seemed more violent on the journey. The unpredictable weather of the rugged mountains posed constant threats to the Corps. One of the closest calls during the expedition occurred on June 29, 1805, when William Clark, Sacagawea, her husband Toussaint Charbonneau, and their 4-month-old baby Jean-Baptiste narrowly escaped a deadly flash flood near the Great Falls of the Missouri River. Charbonneau was a French-Canadian fur trader who had joined the expedition as an interpreter, largely because of his wife Sacagawea, who spoke Shoshone. While his contributions to the journey were valuable, Charbonneau's courage was often questioned by members of the Corps. On this day, their small group scrambled to find shelter from an approaching storm, and they ended up taking refuge on a deep ravine near the river. As the storm intensified, rain and hail began pouring down in torrents, quickly transforming the dry ravine into a raging flood. Clark, realizing the danger at the last moment, grabbed his gun and helped Sacagawea and her baby up the steep bluff just as the water surged. They had never witnessed a flash flood like this one. Charbonneau, paralyzed with fear, barely moved, and if not for Clark's quick thinking, the entire group may have been swept into the river just above its 87-foot falls. Within moments, the water rose to Clark's waist, nearly washing them all away. Sacagawea's cradleboard and their belongings were lost to the flood. But fortunately, everyone made it to higher ground. The group felt a major sense of relief as they watched the waters begin to recede, narrowly avoiding what could have been a fatal loss of these key members of the expedition. While the animals and terrain constantly tested them, they were also battling with their own health and daily nourishment. With the mountainous sections of the West taking longer than expected, their rations were dwindling, and their hunger came to an ugly head in the Bitterroot Mountains of modern-day Montana and Idaho. Crossing the Bitterroot Mountains in the fall of 1805 was a sluggish nightmare, with deep snow blanketing the land and game nowhere to be found across the newly frozen land. The expedition was slowly starving. At their lowest point, the men were forced to eat their own horses, dogs, and even the candles they carried, which were made from animal fat. It was a desperate act to survive, but even those sources weren't enough. It wasn't until the Nez Perce tribe found them, starving and desperate, that they were saved with gifts of food. Without that help, they likely wouldn't have survived the winter. But their experiences with the different Native American tribes varied to the extremes. The expedition also ran into hostile tribes, like the Blackfeet, who had no intention of letting the explorers pass through their territory peacefully. In July 1806, while Lewis was scouting ahead with a small group, they encountered a band of Blackfeet warriors. Tensions quickly escalated when Lewis realized the Blackfeet were trying to steal their horses and guns. In the dead of night, the situation turned violent. Lewis shot one warrior, and another was stabbed in the chaos. The small group of explorers fled, knowing that if the Blackfeet pursued them, it would be a fight to the death. One of the more bizarre near-death moments of the expedition came not from the wilderness, but from within their own ranks. In August 1806, Captain Meriwether Lewis was accidentally shot through the buttocks by one of his own men, Pierre Cruzat. They were hunting along the Missouri River when Lewis, dressed in brown leather, was mistaken for an elk. Cruzat, who had poor eyesight, fired a shot that hit Lewis in his upper left thigh and grazed his right thigh on the way out. At first, Lewis was startled and suspected a Native American surprise attack, but it quickly became clear that it was a case of mistaken identity. Despite the serious pain and shock, Lewis maintained his composure. With the help of Sergeant Patrick Gass, he undressed and treated the wound himself. Fortunately, the bullet had missed both bone and artery, but the injury left Lewis unable to walk for days. While this may have been just a flesh wound, it was another reminder that they had to exercise greater caution, because mistakes could quickly turn fatal out here. To make matters worse, while Lewis was recovering, Clark learned troubling news from fur traders about growing conflicts between the Mandans, Hidatsas, and Arikaras, jeopardizing the fragile peace Lewis and Clark had worked so hard to establish. In one unfortunate moment, Lewis was sidelined, and the future of the expedition's diplomatic efforts became even more uncertain. Despite all the dangers, wild animals, hostile tribes, starvation, deadly rivers, bitter cold, and bullets to the rear, Lewis and Clark's teams succeeded in their mission. They mapped out the West, made contact with numerous native tribes, learned about the new Western land, and opened the doors to the Pacific. But it could have easily gone the other way if not for their strength, skill sets, and of course some luck. Every step of the journey seemed to be a brush with death. If you have a story suggestion, feel free to leave it in the comments. And if you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe so we can continue bringing you these amazing survival stories. Hope to see you in the next one.